Comedian Joan Rivers used to start her routines with the sentence, "Can we talk?" Well, I'm asking you today, can we talk? At the beginning of the service, you heard me to refer to this time after Pentecost that is often referred to as ordinary time. I said then that the time we find ourselves in today is anything but ordinary, when the coverage of the deaths of over 106,000 people in this country because of COVID-19 has been shuffled off the front pages by the murder of George Floyd by a police officer, while 3 of his colleagues either helped or watched this man die, and the protests that followed. All of this made me think of another beginning. You know, in the beginning, the creation poem that opens our Bible. The text was included in the lectionary for this Sunday, but we chose not to read it because of its length and because it's something that's very familiar to all of you. In the beginning, God created. The creation story in Genesis tells of God methodically creating everything. And after each step, God says, "This is good." Over and over, this is good. This is good. This is good. And at the end of the beginning, when God creates human beings and turns over dominion of everything that has been created to you and me, it wasn't just good, it was very good, exceptionally good, supremely good. And we know the rest of the story. From the beginning, we human beings began to make things less than good. We began to push beyond the boundaries God set because we wanted more. There was enough in the Garden of Eden to enjoy a good life with God, but we wanted more. We wanted to be God, having the knowledge of what was good and what was evil, so that we could make the decisions that were reserved for God. I keep saying we instead of Adam and Eve because the problem of wanting more is still with us today, and it played a major role in the murder of George Floyd. When we read about when this country was at its beginning, we read that explorers and other people were looking for a new land. And when they landed on this continent, they said, "Wow, this is good. Let's make it our land." Well, that's a loose translation, but I think it captures the essence of their actions. From the very beginning, they set to get rid of the indigenous people or move them out of the way so that they could enjoy the richness of this land. To do another paraphrase, they may have sung, "This land is my land, it isn't your land." In my heritage, there are several Cherokee people who were moved off their land and endured the Trail of Tears. But the invaders soon found out that working this land was hard. So they went to another land and kidnapped another indigenous people to come and do the work that they didn't want to do, keeping them in chains and denying them a real part of the richness. And they began to teach their children that there were 2 classes of people, us and them, and they aren't really people. When our forefathers looked to shake off the oppression of the English government, they wrote a wonderful document that declared that, quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness," end quote. All the while knowing that that statement wasn't really what they were living. All people were not treated as equals. Certainly not those beings who were in chains and working the fields, doing the jobs that the dominant class didn't want to do. When the Constitution was drafted, how to count all the people in the country so that the states would have a representative say in the government, the slaves were granted the honor of being 3/5 of a real person, a real step up. Of course, slavery wasn't recognized in this country after the Emancipation Proclamation, but in the ensuing 150 plus years, the descendants of the slaves and others who didn't have the right skin tone still find themselves in chains, denied the equal rights we proudly proclaimed in the beginning. Racism is still a reality in this country. But enough about our history, at least for the moment. Let's get back to our faith journey. As followers of Christ, we need to look at how Jesus looked at those people who were deemed less than or enemies of his culture. In every instance, when we see Jesus encountering those on the outskirts of society, we find him touching the untouchables, loving the unlovables, accepting the unacceptables. He taught that God has a preference for those on the edges and those who have fallen off the edge. God has a preference for the hungry, the thirsty, those who are hurting or in prison or who are strangers. Everywhere he looked, everywhere he went, he looked for those who were invisible or overtly pushed aside and welcomed them with love and grace. The only people he criticized were those like the Pharisees who thought that they were better than others, who wanted to show their knowledge and power and connection with God so everyone would know their place. There were people that in that in crowd of Jesus's time that just wouldn't associate with or even consider being with or acknowledge that they even existed except to give them someone to hate. I've already eased one paraphrase of a song reference, and as you know me, you know that there's always a song not far on the horizon when you're around me. Well, there's another song that I was reintroduced to when I was in a community theater production of South Pacific. I had the role of Emile Debec, a wealthy plantation owner on a South Pacific island. Emile had been married to a native woman and had several children by her before she died. Enter a Navy nurse named Nellie Forbush, who fell in love with Emile and had a problem with his mixed race children. Also in the picture was a Marine lieutenant named Cable who was in love with a native girl, but was concerned with the possible consequences if they were to marry. Nellie was of the opinion that racism is something that she can't help, that it's born in her. But Emile refuses to believe that prejudice is born in you. And when he confronts Lieutenant Cable, Cable says, "It's not born in you. It happens after you're born." And begins to sing one of the most profound songs I know. You've got to be carefully taught. I'd sing it now, but there are copyright restrictions that I don't hold, so I'll just summarize it. It says that you and I have to be carefully taught to hate and fear before it's too late, before we are 6 or 7 or 8, to hate all the people our relatives hate. We've got to be taught to be afraid of those people whose eyes are oddly made and people whose skin is a different shade. Racism isn't born in us, it's carefully taught. And isn't that what Jesus taught? Hating and being afraid of those who are different from us is not God's intention or plan. Treating others as less than and denying them an equal chance to enjoy the richness of the good creation we've all been given to take care of is against the will of God. And when we go against the will of God, there's not much good that results. There's another old song, an oldie from the 60s, titled "For What It's Worth." And it begins, "Something's happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop, children. What's that sound? Everybody look what's going down." Does that raise any images to you? Certainly does to me, with the tragic news of a man with a gun telling George Floyd he's got to beware, and then choking him to death. I wonder if there would be any outcry at all if some young lady hadn't made a video of the entire occurrence. This certainly wasn't the first time something like this has happened when a person of color was deemed less than by a person of authority. But will this current uproar and protesting make any difference, or will it fade into the air and join the other tragedies? Psalm 8 that Pastor Samar read earlier has the psalmist looking up to the heavens and contemplating the majestic creation around him, wondering just how he and other humans fit in now that we've made such a mess of the creation we've been put in charge of. Are we still worthy of your thoughts, God? Are we still worthy of your grace and love? You created us to be a little lower than the angels, but that wasn't enough. We've kept trying to climb to higher places where we don't belong. From the first humans who just had to have the fruit of the only tree that was forbidden of them, we have tried to get more than our share. Are you still there, Lord? The other text is from Paul's second letter to the church in Corinth, inviting them and us to put things in order. As I look at our world today, I see that we've done a great job of trying to reorder the majestic creation to suit our wants and needs. And if that meant shutting some people out, then so be it. We've been trying so hard to play God, making decisions of what is most important to us, regardless of how they affected others. As long as I've got mine, that's all that's important. When I hear the phrase put things in order, I think of something we all need to do, putting our affairs in order. This usually comes up at the end of life when we begin to consider what and how we want to hand down and what we want to give to the next generation, sorting out all the things we have and telling a trusted friend where everything is and what we want to happen. While that may not be what Paul was thinking about, it certainly fits our present situation. No matter what our age or stage of life, we need to put things in order, to decide what we are leaving to those who will follow. What are we handing down? We sometimes talk about the great cloud of witnesses that have gone before us, leaving to us what they have learned and accumulated. We are in that cloud now. Even those of you who might be 6 or 7 or 8. I recently saw a video of a small black child in a park where there were many different shades of people. His mother was trying to corral him, but he was having nothing to do with that. He ran up to a white man sitting on the ground and hugged him several times, and then was off to another person hugging them as well. That, my friends, is a witness to the unquestioning love of God. There is no inside or outside of God. We are all worthy of that hug, even though we can't actually hug each other now that the virus is still so active and causing death and heartache. You know, COVID-19 primarily attacks our lungs, making it difficult to breathe. On Thursday, I watched the memorial service for George Floyd in Minneapolis. Reverend Al Sharpton gave the eulogy, and it was a barn burner. If you didn't see it, you really missed something. At the end of the service, he invited everybody to stand in silence for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. The time the police officer knelt on George's neck, cutting off his ability to breathe. As I stood there in my hallway with my eyes clouded and closed, listening to the soft music in the background, my thoughts were, here I am standing, but George wasn't able to stand. And here I am breathing, but George wasn't able to breathe. And that nearly 9 minutes seemed like an eternity. And it was in those 9 minutes that George Floyd went to eternity, because he was seen as lesser than in the eyes of that policeman. We may not take the life of someone else like what happened in that well-documented 8 minutes and 46 seconds. But I believe that part of putting things in order, as Paul has invited us to do, is for us to consider how we have participated in the lessening of life for those that don't look like us. How have we pushed to the edges of society those who we'd rather not associate with or even wish that they weren't there at all? When Jesus calls us to love our neighbor, who do we hope isn't considered our neighbor? Jesus was pretty specific about that, much to our chagrin perhaps, but Jesus said that we are all neighbors and should treat each other with love and dignity. Anything less is less than what God created us to be and do. Speaking of neighbors, I think of Fred Rogers, whose persona on TV was one of neighbors of all kinds. When segregation wasn't officially in effect, but was still practiced in so many ways, he invited a black mailman to sit with him and soak his feet in the small kiddie pool of water. It caused quite a stir at the time, but things really didn't change in the world that much. But maybe that image resonated in the minds of the small children who watched Mr. Rogers. And some of them might be in the crowds of protesters who were saying, enough is enough. Back briefly to the Garden of Eden. They had everything they needed, but that wasn't enough. I see the same thing in our country right now. Enough is never enough when I can have your share too. But I say enough is enough of that kind of thought. If our country begins to live up to the words on those foundational documents, it will be time for the equality we claim to be so proud of to become a reality. If we are ever to see the peace that passes all understanding, that the Prince of Peace we claim as our leader taught and lived and called his followers to work toward, enough is enough. It isn't easy, but it's time. Amen.